We'll take another 5 minutes, if you don't mind. Nitasha?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
We weren't sure if this was the right thing, the right one.
It is, it's us. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Let's give it 5 minutes because I just opened the Zoom now, and so I think some people need to connect.
I had a question, Mao, like just to show like some of the clip for the film. Should I send you the Vimeo link, or I have it as a file on my computer? Like, what's the best?
Yeah, you can share the video.
Okay. Yeah.
From your computer, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we should also just share the. Well, we can't share the link because it's not public. Okay.
No.
Yeah. All right.
Cool.
We'll see. The sound is always an issue on this.
I know. I'm coming back. I'm gonna grab a glass of water. 1 sec.
Okay. What are you doing?
Fly. I got the notebook for you.
Mm-hmm.
We should flip the page. Get centered.
Here we are.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So now it's working, right?
Yes, it's all working.
Perfect. I'm here at Reina Sofia. Maybe this building is Reina.
What are you doing? What are you organizing?
No, nothing. I'm going to have dinner with some friends. Friday night.
Friday night, exactly. What are we doing? Hi, Brett. He's not there.
Hi, Mao.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Amin. Hi, Natasha.
Hi.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Did you have a good meeting with Max?
Yeah, nice to see you as well. Yeah, I was looking forward to this. Mao, was that you asking me a question? Sorry.
Yeah. Don't worry. You finish your.
No, I think it was. We were done.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're done.
This is like the Zoom in the middle moment. You just don't know what's going on.
You here, the Institute of Radical Imagination, Nitasha Dhillon and Amin Husain, the MTL Collective, and who I've been admiring and following for a long time. And I had the pleasure to meet Amin in Athens for the Biennale, but not Nitasha. So it's great that now we're together here presenting your project Unsettling, but also with you, I've been hoping to build a conversation that goes beyond this event about decolonizing film, and we started putting together a nice text. And I'm sure that we will involve more people in this conversation. So that this is just the beginning of the conversation, and we'll start informally. And so, yeah, you're welcome to introduce the film, to show images, and then we'll start a discussion, a conversation between us. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Why don't you get us started on the film? No, come on.
Just okay. So one way we actually do emphasize like what we imagine having a conversation, and what we wanted to do is not so much talk about our project, but talk about the process of making something, and the questions that have come up, and the things that we are refusing. And that's, to us, kind of, it's not about decolonizing film for us. It's not about anything like that. It's about how do we get free, and what is the role of a filmmaker or making films is. And I think that from that vantage point, we're going to refer to a project that we've been working on, I would say, thinking about for 10 years, and shooting it for 3 or 4 years, and editing it for also 2 years. And it should get done. That's what we're working on right now since the pandemic. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that we've not just been working on the film. That's why it's been taking so long, because, you know, film is really, like, for us, it's not really about the object of film necessarily, but more around like the process of making a film. The reason, making a film that makes sense for the political moment that we are in, which is also a film about Palestine, when there's already so many films about Palestine. And so in some ways, I think that, what we've been doing is organizing here in New York, but also coming from contexts of, Punjab, like, or India, Palestine, and then thinking about what movement means, and what movement generated theory, and what movement generated art means. So, which in this case, for us, the filmmaker is not separate from the organizer, right? They both kind of go back and forth, and they actually inform each other. So filmmaking isn't a separate task from, like, movement building or the struggle for liberation. And I think this is really important, because it's very similar to the way people think about artists, right? Like, quite often what happens with thinking about filmmaking and movement building is that filmmakers are often just more involved in the idea of representing a film versus representing a movement versus being the movement or being part of the movement, and kind of dissolving that boundary, which I think is really important. So in some ways, what has happened is, since 2010, which is when me and Amin met at International Center of Photography, we started even questioning the image, right? What is the revolutionary potential of the image when photography is almost dying, right? In that sense, as a medium, and it's imperial, and the tool in itself is imperial, and the archives. I mean, we can, there's all of that, of course, which is part of this. And so, we started, and then, for us, again, one of the really important things is learning from our failures. And these ones are very obvious failures for any filmmaker. I mean, like, what I'm going to share is not anything, like, it's not rocket science. It's basically, we both started, we're like, oh, let's make a documentary about Palestine. Oh, then we were like, oh, let's make a character-driven documentary around Palestine. Oh, Amin is one person. We have other movement people in it. David Graeber was one of them. Andrew Ross, Jasbir Puar. We take them to Palestine, and we talk about Palestine and what it means for us today. But as we're making this film, we're also questioning the role of aesthetics, the role of, the camera, the filmmaker, what editing does, and all of these different things. And so in the process, what we end up doing is making 2 films that we scrap because they don't make any sense. And especially because in the realm of documentary, one of the things that we realize is that so much of the work that exists out there is pain-driven versus desire-driven, right? It's constantly about the pain and the violence of what Palestine is. And even if they're revolutionary films, they still follow the same logic of, like, let's say, patriarchal movement building, or like, this kind of nationalist agenda to even, the liberation struggle. And so that's where I think the idea of decoloniality really becomes important, because then the question is also like, yes, a film for the liberation of Palestine, but in what context outside of the nation state, right? When everything right now around Palestine is also about building a nation state. So, that's been some of the kind of background. You want to add anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think in thinking about it, you know, issues that we'll talk about that have come up are like the idea of representation. Why would you want to represent? Can you represent? Is that the point, to represent? Or is it to enunciate or to amplify or to create space? Well, how can a film create space? How can a film facilitate asking different questions, asking better questions? How can film how can you with film try to create the possibility of images that are accountable to people, that are emanating from a feeling, a moment, a question? And that cannot be, then you have to take harder routes. When we thought that, you know, it would be character driven, is because we needed to kind of put things through the character, through the editing, that would help people understand, but you also wanted to give them a structure that they're used to. But the issue there that comes up is like, do they matter as much? Like, in other words, if you help them understand, what do they do that with that understanding? We have never seen an immense amount of pain being shown that also changes the people's behavior. Okay, so what is that about? Well, most likely it's about power. Well, if it's about power and struggle, then what kind of alliances or coalitions are we building? Not in the organizational sense, but more of a coalition of people that want to get free. I want to say that in relation to freedom, this is really important. We're not talking about self-determination like it was characterized in the 60s and 70s, that became synonymous with independence, that then produced a government, and in essence, a carceral structure. We're talking about how does the act of self-determination every day and a recognition of debts that we owe to each other because of the colonial condition that we're in. How can those kind of relationships be the things that we nurture, right? And in that sense, decolonization is about unsettling everything. It's about restructuring. It's about giving value to different things. It's about not changing form or changing substance or changing a camera or changing any of these things. It actually requires us to be involved and engaged, and in the process also want to make films. Then the questions of the movement become the questions of the film in an embodied sense. And I think then the filmmaker doesn't have, you know, this idea of having a position that is problematic. It isn't about problematic. It's about how do you locate in yourself in the struggle to get free. So then you're going to say, well, I'm not in prison. Why am I not free? And the reality is that you're complicit in some, if you're both an oppressor and oppressed, and you're probably complicit in harms that are being kind of enacted every day on someone else, and you're benefiting from certain sets of privileges, regardless of where you come from or what color of skin or gender or anything like that. All of these things become, why do you need to get free? It has to do with the idea of time, and having to do with the idea of desire, and having to do the idea of actually living the kind of life that you want to live in relation to people you love, and generosity and care and feeling and being able to not live. Imagine, are you free if you walk down the street and you see someone homeless or houseless, and then it makes you feel bad, and you don't want to see them, and you don't want to endure that because it's out of your control. So what do? You cross the street and you don't look. I wonder whether you're free. That's the issue. So then how can film help us see differently? How can film help us reorient to not just that we are actually, it's very hard, but people are doing it every day. But not to say that living is a resistance, but is to think of the fact that we are doing acts of resistance, we just don't recognize them as such. And the recognition is everything. Because this whole thing is predicated on an illusion that we can't get free, that we're better off in the conditions that we are now. Because, hey, you know what? They tried it in the 60s and 70s, and they tried it in the 80s and 90s, and they tried it for hundreds of years, and it's not perfect, Obama will tell you, but it's still better. And this is the best that we can do. And I think that film has, for us, this is not like
an attempt.
Yeah, for us, these are the challenges that we set ourselves perhaps to fail. But these are what's interesting in the process of filmmaking for us.
And I mean, I think we're right now in the editing phase of it, but just, reiterating the fact that we're not, even though we're going to show you some 7 minutes of a film that it doesn't really embody any of the experiences that we've had. And we can talk more about it once we show the clip. But one thing I wanted to mention was that even we didn't have any treatment. We didn't have any idea what we were going to do. We started with character driven, but then very quickly in a week's time switched and just ended up being on the ground and just hearing what does it mean to think about organizing with Palestine. And that's really what, every trip that we went to, we had conversations with people in refugee camps, also not just in Ramallah, which is the bubble, the capital in terms of that, but just really having the conversation of what does organizing mean for Palestine. And I think those conversations then allowed us to go to places that we would have not thought about, or facilitate that, including, let's say, there was one of the people who was part of making the film is Habashi from Aida refugee camp. So a lot of the thing was also just participating, not as embedded in the community, that's usually the way people think, oh, are you embedded in the community, right? That's always the way people talk about, filmmaking when it comes to Palestine, but actually more like, are you actually part of the movement building with Palestine, right? And the difference between that. And I think the way we were doing it was how are we going to organize with Palestine? Because we also organize about Palestine over here in New York and understand Palestine through Kashmir and through all of these different struggles as well. And I think that's what we were trying to think about with the film. And so in its current structure right now, the way we are working on it is the film is in 3 acts. The first act is really just about the present condition of settler colonization, which is it's the extraction, it's the dystopia, it's this level of thinking that the reality is absolutely dystopic. And it's also about modernity, and modernity being always the one possible future, right? So the way we look at the settlements, or the way you look at the train, that's the only possible future. And for us, one of the questions is, in general, is why do all the futures look the same, right? Why can't we imagine different futures? And so the first part of the film is just really showing that kind of dystopia. And then the second part of the film, which is Act 2, is this idea of refusal and reorientation, right? What happens if you strike? What happens if you refuse this particular future that modernity has set us out for, right? It's what if we refuse, and what kind of other options then exist? And then Act 3 then becomes about a completely different time and space, which is outside of our colonial condition of thinking on this linear trajectory, and more okay, well, how can we think about movements, not just in terms of these crises that happen, but on a structural level, but also on a spiritual level, and also at the core of keeping land, water, and air central to this struggle, right? And so what does it mean to then escape into deep time or ancient time when you're talking about Palestine? There's in Act 3 you see images of Jericho, which is the oldest wall that you can think about, or and so how do you even start questioning about time? So really it's just, I think, as Amin was talking about, is how can the film make you feel differently? And it's just more about this psychological kind of landscape. That's it. Do you want to add anything before I
Well,
show?
also it was how do you honor a struggle, but also not exceptionalize Palestine, right? I mean, there's nothing exceptional about what's happening in Palestine. And I think that people articulate difference and an exception in order to garner attention, but it's because we're starved, right? So there's a questioning of a type of strategy in which how we move in the world. And I think that, again, why Palestine? And I think for us is because Palestine really is an example of the future. And this is something Jaspir Pawar and Nitasha say, is it kind of exemplifies the future of all of us. You can, and now how does that translate into reality? We say a lot of stuff, but it's becoming from a lot of different places. But Pompeo yesterday was talking about citizenship, and Israelis having citizenship. And then they also have a US citizenship. And then now they can claim that or state that in their passports. This was yesterday by executive order, right? So you have to understand that what we see in Trump isn't, Trump's been happening since 1492. Trump is an iteration of colonialism coming home, right? And it looks like fascism, but it's the same, right? It's just who's being targeted. And I think that this is the moment in which we may not, you know, it may not be Hours of the Furnace, it may not be Battle of Algiers, right? But if you think about those films as films that were, you know, and there are many others, but like films that are meant to do something different, even if they're not doing it well. They're trying to think of film and the act of making in the process of getting free. Not other people's freedom, their own, each of us. This is really important because it's on that basis in which you can build something that is broad, wide, and uncontrollable. You know, and I think like film in that sense, Palestine offers that because you see it being exported. You know, before there was Trump, there was Netanyahu. You know what I mean? These people's relationship to it is similar, but now they go after Corbyn. You know, it's all happening, right? None of these people are heroes. You know, Corbyn isn't a hero, but the idea of like the thing keeps closing. So then our films can't be reaction to something. They can't be a reaction to something. They have to be doing something else that understands and reads the moment, but seeks to produce something that is not contained. Because I'll give you an example of Palestine. And this is something that we had to think about in relation to checkpoints. The gendering of the occupation produces a masculinity and gendering. The emasculation of Palestinians, the killing of Black men. Think about it here. It's an emasculation of a struggle, right? That then produces a patriarchy in response, right? So the overall structures are constantly being upheld in the act of resisting something, right? If we don't have a broader sense of what that is. So I think that, you know, and so what we did is like we shot footage, we had an understanding, we were mapping. And the basic question is just like, soldiers don't kill people, structures kill people. Like, it's just like, and you know that from AK serial killer or Musawa Dachi. Like, there has to be another way for film to get at the structural thing that's producing the characters that kill and hurt and harm each other. If you keep thinking, oh, well, this police officer will be prosecuted, we'll defund the police. Those are not the society that we want to create. And this is something that, you know, Fred Moten says. This is like, what is abolition? It's not the abolition of prisons or police. It's abolition of a society, right? That requires prisons and police and whatever. That's the thing. And you can't react to the prison and police to produce that kind of reality. So then, did we know what the hell the answer was? No. Has it been frustrating? I have never found a more challenging experience in my entire life. And I have gone through a lot. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? And it's been crazy. And the thing, when we said we made 2 movies and we scrapped them, we literally, you always think you have a good idea until you try it out, you show it to other people. So you need a community. And they actually agree with you. And then you sit on it for a second and you're just like, why would I put this in the world? Why? So recognition of like, it's all a process.
Yeah.
But the recognition of like, you do something and like, is this asking the questions that can generate better questions?
Yes. I think I'll start the clip this is the beginning of the film. We're just gonna show 7 minutes. Think of it as more like a trailer kind of a thing, but this is how the film begins. So like, you know, what I was talking about in terms of the dystopia of the occupation and settler colonization in general, this is that part. So you're not gonna see the reorientation or the next step. We're working on the second section of the film right now. And so that's in process. So
Can I just say what an amazing introduction to the film?
Oh, thank you. My host disabled attendee screen sharing, if somebody could. And I hope the sound works too, we'll see. This text is just a placeholder. It's not part of the film. I just had it up there. So let me know if the sound is working and it shares that.
That's not.
I'm not sure if we're not hearing the sound. Other people also not hearing the sound.
I'm wondering.
Let's see if
It's probably not loud enough. Do you see? Should we try to connect it to the? Yeah, let's try it. No, we're gonna try. We're gonna try to connect it to sound.
Yeah.
It's also we'll try to connect it to sound.
Do you want to say something in the meantime while I do that?
No. I think one thing in terms of thinking about sound and image, it's just like, again, we were trying, because they ask you a lot of questions. They're just like, well, who's your audience? Like these crazy questions. And I think that one of the things about that is like, we knew it's almost like a Wu-Tang response. Is it's like, we just wanted to see the film. I've watched a lot of films about Palestine, and I never watched a film that I wanted to see, and I think like then, or it's just this idea of like, people really haven't seen Palestine. And I think that the ability to see and to see differently is really part of what I think is important to us. And then the second thing is like, how like people talk about unlearning and undoing? What would that look like in relation to the image? And I think part of what that was is thinking about, well, what is the occupation tries to let you see things a particular way. So what about making the background the foreground and thinking of editing techniques in that regard and shooting that way, as using the camera as a way to map or counter map, and then look at in the studio or wherever, what is the image? Is it connecting?
No, it's a little more problem.
Ready to connect.
No.
Gabriela.
Yes, if I can just help a little bit, if you want to connect the audio, when you go to share your screen, it shows you your computer, and underneath you should select
share computer sound.
Shares computers audio, shares videos audio, so that we all listen to the audio played by your computer.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. I was wondering about that. Okay, that makes sense.
Great, Gabriela. Grazie.
Thank you. I have not. This is the first Zoom audio event into. I hope this works. The starting of the audio is anyways a little low, so.
So yeah, I mean, I think that
The sound was really bad. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's
But
low.
then I realized that I shouldn't. I mean, it should be slightly. The
Higher.
sound construction is good, but the volume should have been slightly higher.
and we can talk about sound and image, and we'd
Yeah.
love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, this is a work in progress, and I think that part of why it's so important, part of the process of making this film, is the conversations it produces around it. It's just as important, and I don't think of the film in a way. That's also, it's holding space and facilitating space for these kind of conversations. So, and then all of this came from Act One, that is just, you know, probably right now it's picture lock at 23 minutes. So we can even talk about those kind of details, which I know matter. So it's picture locked at 23 minutes, and that's it, you know.
Cool.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, let's.
I'm not going somewhere. I'm
Does
sorry.
anybody wants to start with the comments on we've seen, or on the introduction? I was very grateful for the introduction that really works with the images. But I will let someone else speak first. If you have comments or questions for Nitasha and Amin. Okay, I will start with it. So, well, first I really love the film, and especially in relationship to what you were saying about this way of thinking, how to decolonize really the mind, as well as you know, the process of filming. And I think it's what I appreciate about the images I've seen is that there are a lot of quite elemental images about land and rain and landscape, a political landscape and checkpoints, so, and cages. So the in a way the film really gets into let's say this idea of I mean, this process of decolonizing, starting from the images. I mean, I'm curious to know a couple of things. First, how you are thinking, you know, how basically the rest of the film goes. And secondly, also because reading the article of Nitasha is also interesting the way the film, as you were saying also, I mean, it follows a process that was a process of activism, but also a process of telling the story of decolonization with different tools. So it was also about talking. It was, you were commissioned by Creative Times, this video essays. So there were a lot of kind of visuals, or, you know, parts of the story that you told in another way. And so I was thinking how you want to distribute this film in relationship to this other conversation that you had, and how they fit also in relationship to these other forms of telling, your story, or telling, the story we all should recognize exists already there, perhaps. That's my first question.
Well, I think this other story starting, you mentioned the creative time thing. I think this is when we say, like, we've been trying to think of this film for 10 years now, is because we've actually, like, and this connects to the landscape and the mapping. So before we actually started, and then that the idea that filmmaking being a process, like if you're really engaged in, decoloniality, that in itself is a process. So what is a process of making decolonial film when film is already such a colonial thing, right? The tool, like all of these different things. And so for us, it started with just like, going to Palestine and just understanding, the kind of cartography of the occupation. And that's, I think, the article that, I talked about, which is basically, we just, drove around Palestine, had conversations like, how do the settlements function in relation to, let's say, Palestinian villages and refugee camps,
And try to get lost.
And try to get lost. And then getting lost just means that getting caught by either the Palestinian Authority police or the Israeli police, right? Or like, the intelligence of the refugee camps. So like, the kind of security coordination on the land is really deep. Like, it's not that, if you're like walking around in Palestine, like, in whatever, what is called Area A, you're safe necessarily. And so, the process in itself has been just like, making the film. And then that combined with like, being part of like, like I was mentioning, movement conversations. One thing that you don't see is like, we also were part of like 2 different funerals that happened at the same time when we were there. And so like, the question then starts becoming like, how do you document this? It's not that I'm there to, me and Amin both worked on the film, but most of the camera work is like, I know, I was in the, like, I was the person documenting. And so the question then is like, I'm also not from Palestine, but I'm, I understand the context. I come from like Punjab, and, like, I fit in. So the whole process was just really amazing, because it was just, you're part of a community and you're there, and like, then there's no questions asked. That's what you do. It is what being a political accomplice means, right? And like, what does it mean in this context is you follow BDS, you do all of these things. But then what happens is this whole unlearning with Palestine, it functions both as an aesthetic and an image and a form and in an organizing element and all of these different things. And I think we can talk a little bit more about aesthetics here, because film, like, once again it bounds it to an object, but the aesthetics is really the movement work that needs to be done, right? And then what comes out of it, because aesthetics is very much about like, who rules your senses? How do you even feel in this world? And when you're living under colonial conditions and structures, you feel a certain way, right? And that's the kind of, and so when you start thinking about decolonially about aesthetics, so how does then that transfer into the way you organize actions in the terms of like, what is the time and space that you're creating that helps you unsettle the current structure and make you feel differently? And so then what does the role of the aesthetics come through, and then how does the image come through within that? And so I think that's been our journey with Palestine, where we started with like very much straight up documentary photography, did landscape, understanding the occupation, how it functions, how it feels, then doing this mapping element of like, all right, how does like, so we worked with Michael Hart at that point, but like Palestine, de-exceptionalizing Palestine. Palestine also has, people have debt. It's represented in the sense there's so many images of Palestine. Why do we need another image of Palestine? Representation, it's still the same thing. Palestinian Authority, there hasn't been an election for I don't know how many years.
It's not
but
about,
it's not about the Palestinian Authority is considered as a representation of a voice of a movement, right? Mm-hmm. And then the fourth being securitized, which I think is really important for where we are right now, is that Palestine is also a testing ground for Israeli army and like all the military and the development of technology that happens then goes outwards into the world, Kashmir, all of these different things. And that's when, Jasbir Puar said at that point is that, Palestine's coming for all of us. And I feel like she said that in 2016 to me while making this film. And in 2020, I feel like it is everywhere. It is in Kashmir, it is in Punjab, it's in New York. Like we have seen this escalation of this kind of, collaborations that are happening and technologies that are kind of secular colonial technologies that are working across the platform. And so then the question then becomes is like, what is our aesthetics when you look at that? And then that's why we look at the image of the incision on the mountains, right, where the settlements are made. You see that with the wolf sign, which is the sign of the settlements, right? It comes from like a mythology, but you have settlements and your wolf. And so there's this extraction of land. So this whole process then is part of also understanding, what does a movement against settler colonization look like? What does a movement against modernity look like? What does a movement against demanding different futures look like? And how does then film help you understand and feel and look at it differently?
Thank you. I saw that Philip Rix joined us, and also Zaino is with us. I don't know if you want to ask anything. Philip didn't, you just connected, so you didn't see the images.
I mean, it's exciting. I was planning on emailing Philip after I got the
Mabruk, congratulations.
I'm so excited for your new film.
Yeah,
Thank
can't
you,
wait to
thank
see
you.
it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's funny, I ran into Philip, we ran into each other in Cairo when we were editing the film with Luli. So we overlapped at that time.
But we also met in Venice. That
Oh, yeah,
was
yeah.
the best thing, during an action.
Yeah, sorry I'm joining a bit late. It was dinner time and we had to put Shams to sleep. So I missed probably the core of your message.
No,
I thought I would try and
Good to
catch
see
what I
you.
can.
it's good to see you. Yeah.
too.
You great you join us. The presentation was great, and yeah, and also the images.
Presentation is continuous. We can begin a whole other conversation now.
Brett?
Yeah, I'm happy to share some thoughts. Well, one, I really appreciated the I guess expanded context that you gave at the start, because that really gave a lot of depth to the footage that we saw. But I sort of scribbled down a few notes, like just not reading the Creative Time article. I haven't seen that one, but I've been following, you know, your broader movement work over the last number of years, going back to, geez, I can't even remember when we sat down. That must have been like 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, maybe even longer. But yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. Some of the things that really resonated with me was, well, one, you both had brought up movement, like this idea of motion. That movement is sort of a concept in motion, which I think corresponds well to the motion of film itself. And this idea that it's not really like the film and organizing is not, they're not separate initiatives. That if you can make a film from the site of organizing, it has a certain potency and it has a certain attachment to that movement versus it coming from the outside. And it would be very hard to speak about something like that from the outside. I think that in terms of the structure, like it really resonated, the image sound. One, the still shots of just the camera on the tripod without characters, but capturing the movement in scene gives a sense, I think, that this is about structural movement and about the deeper structural concerns that you raised, not the sort of one-offs, but really an abolishment of a much bigger system that's not only in Palestine, but that's transnational or global. Yeah, so I think that relationship between the human relation and the land as a site of both the settler colonial dynamic. Like I loved the wolf sign, I loved the mountain shots, I loved the fluidity of humans going through that time and space. And this, I kept coming back to this question, like, are aesthetics and ethics the same? Meaning, you know, you laid out a very clear statement about the film and how do the aesthetics sort of map up to that in the process of the filmmaking, which up to this point, the 7 minutes of shots, it seems like they're based on a structure of unlearning and not, you know, based on the colonial narrative that film has, where, you know, your edits have to be 10 seconds and you need to introduce a character quickly. And, you know, as you said, I mean, like, who is this for? Who's the audience? When actually, in the fact, the way you structured it, the audience is not only yourselves, but it's anyone living in a settler colonial relationship state, which is arguably everybody in the world at this point. So yeah, those were a couple quick thoughts. Very much enjoyed it. Thanks for having me join.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks for those beautiful thoughts.
That was amazing.
Really helpful.
Yeah, I think the point that you made around, the structural movement being captured with the camera being on the tripod, I think that was absolutely spot on.
The challenge, Brett, is like when we were, see, the thing is like, it's like so much of, this is why documentary is crazy, because so much of it is like trying to capture reality and then represent it as if that will alter behavior. And I think like that's not a project we want to engage in. So then that begs another question, which is like, well, then how can the images function differently? But then if the images, I don't know what the answer to that question, we're trying to figure it out, but that can be separate from the political project. So then you need to have some kind of analysis, which is then, why is Palestine important to me? Not as a nation state. Maybe like Mahmoud Darwish said, is a metaphor, as an idea. But to me, it's because it's about freedom. And somehow Palestine is inextricably linked with me being unfree, right? Then you got to say, okay, so that's my political project, but then how do I live? Because I'm living. In the process of living, we have to both love, all the things that you want to do in life. And then you want to make a film that advances the task of living. Right? In a very deeply political way. So, but you don't want to torture people because you don't want to be tortured. Like, it's not about like, avant-garde, let's go. So in another way, it's beginning from a different point and going to a different point. The hope or the thing is like, we will work hard to produce something that is both interesting to us in making it and difficult making it, but also interesting to the people that watch it. And in the project of the screen and the experience of the film and the togetherness that we create, we advance a conversation, not with everyone, because you're not interested in having a conversation with everyone, right? But I do want my mom and dad, if they were alive, to want to watch it. Like, you know what I mean? So then there's something around elitism and the academy and form that inhibits this whole process. That's why I was saying, when people asked us, well, who's the audience? What's the story? What's your one tagline? What's your perspectives? No one funded this film in that way. But then we found ways to fund it. This film has cost us, honestly, over 100,000. It has to. But we applied to Doha, we applied to a couple, no one gave us money, right? Because they want a preconceived notion of what the thing is, and we want to use the film in order to get free.
Yeah,
it's a very different thing. So then we Jaspir Poir, Andrew Ross, people like that were like, you should go to Palestine. Now, what was the idea there? The idea there is that they can tap into their money at the university for research. We'll connect them with people that we work with on the ground. We'll all spend time together and we'll shoot in the so-called field, but then we spend time together living, talking about what we experienced. The next day you go out, you're shooting differently. We didn't start with a tripod. We actually heard people then say, why would you shoot Palestine with a tripod? That is in fact like privilege. But it's about letting the camera run for us.
Yeah.
It's about actually learning how to see. That's why it was important to get lost. Now you could say what was it in the French, the preceding May, May 68, wandering and getting lost, because we talked about the idea of, the situation. So we talked about like getting lost as a way of like relearning or learning differently the geography of the city. But it's also about not following the paths that colonialism constructs in order for you to survive. There's something about that in which motion and movement is important. People talk about a movement as if Black Lives Matter is a movement or Standing Rock is a movement. These are ruptures in time that produce a different relationship to reality, a different relationship to each other, that somehow has a different decolonial, you could say, time or deep time to them. But they're all ruptures in which we're trying to find each other and figure things out. The movement is when we coalesce together and then we move out in the world, and then we'll definitely come back together, and the intervals may be shorter, which is what we're seeing right now. But in that process of movement, it's about the movements that we have in our daily life. We do them every day. So people talked about structure. The first one is about dystopia in the present, but it's also about your different relationship to the image. Then the second part is about refusal and reorientation. The refusal is to say yes, and that opens up a million no's. Like one million
no,
yeses.
opposite.
Yeah, from the Zapatistas. But the idea there then is just like, okay, or John Holloway talks about cracks, like in Crack Capitalism. Whatever the metaphors you need to think about, you have to not reproduce the thing. Even if you go to the martyr's funeral where 3 people died and the community wanted us to record and we were with them, right? What is that thing beyond someone dying?
How do we reorient ourselves?
Where's the generosity that is there? Where's the care that is there? Not so then you can put it in an aesthetics and give it to people, but then somehow film is kind of showing something that is often not seen, not to others outside, but to each other.
Yeah.
So I have a question, 2 quick questions, and then maybe I wanted to open also to other people. Did they tell you that the tripod is privileged? That's what they told you?
We've heard people say that to us. Yeah.
It's interesting.
I mean, it was before they saw the images, and they wanted us to make documentary because so the camera moving, right?
I mean, I think
is about also, subjectivity. But
it's also people who are coming from the cinema were chased out. I mean, so there's a whole, keep going.
But like, the idea of subjectivity, or the idea of like, well, I know there's someone behind the camera, so why are you putting it on a tripod and pretending that there isn't someone behind the camera? And you're just like, my God, this is why.
Because there's
people, but this is why we say you got to ask better questions.
Exactly. No, the other thing that really interesting is the way in your activist work you bring together the kind of decolonizing struggles with other struggle in New York, so anti-gentrification struggle and other forms of class struggle, feminist struggle. So and one of the things that is interesting about the debate on indigenous cinema in comparison with third cinema was this idea of critique to the nation state and trying to create a different notion of visual sovereignty, or anyway to use to use the camera to create different political alliances that were not necessarily aligned with the nation state. And my question is, how do you think about the process? How do you think to bring this back to New York, or to, let's say, to link this to what's happening in terms of colonizing also New York, or how do you link, let's say, the 2 struggles together visually, if you do that, or if you want to do that in the future, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, we thought about that in making the film. And so, the obvious things is like, do you use interviews? We did a lot of interviews, right? But then it'll get to your point, because it's about taking a film that you would show in Palestine, or taking a film that you would show in a movement context, to then another context or a different geography, means that there's a specificity of struggles where it's being shown. So then the question is like, the person will either view it in relation to Palestine or view it as something that is universal. Well, we're definitely not going with the something universal. We're going with Palestine. But the thing about Palestine is that, like we said, if we do it right, you will see your future and your stakes in the film that you're watching, the visual vocabulary around land. Brett, have you been to Palestine?
Nope.
Okay. The way Brett talked about it, though, right? Relationship of land. It's outside of the context. And it's not just relating to Palestine, the land, the structures of domination, right? The movement, the people, the class, the whatever, but without hitting it on the head, because that's not the topic of the conversation. The film isn't about class. The film is how to get free. It's desire driven, but then you can't be didactic. And there isn't a political program that's ready. So what is it that you're promoting? So then what is the function of film? We're giving one answer. That's just one answer.
Yeah.
That's great. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No.
No, I think the only thing that I was going to say in terms of the connection, I think that I'm going to go back to aesthetics. I think that when you see, settlements in this way, or like if you really is starting to think about modernity and you're trying to go against modernity, the way you think about modernity, we've seen so many of these other films, right? What's the name of the Metropolis, for example, right? That's a very iconic, like modernity kind of film that we have. And so if you're looking at that and then you think about like Palestine and what they're trying to do with that is very similar in terms of the trains, the settlements and things like that. So in the rhythm of modernity, you have to crash that, right? And that's also part of the future that is there in Palestine. Settlements, not just like, Israeli settlements, but also Palestinian gated communities. You have, places like Rawabi and there's others like that. And you'll see that eventually in the film. So it's really this question of like both settler colonization and neoliberalism, but through aesthetics and like
capitalism,
but like I don't want to say aesthetics, but really using this space and time of the film to make you feel it, right? Versus anybody trying to tell you anything. So there's no voiceover.
Because you'll recognize it.
You recognize it from your own condition. I'm pretty like, as somebody coming from Punjab, but also somebody who's organizing here, when you see an incision in the land that way, you know what's going on, right? When you see water being stolen, you know what's going on. And then when you and I think the second act, which we haven't shown, but like this idea of reorientation to each other is also about relationship building, right? Relation building, and what does relations really mean today? And in terms of even community and organizing, and I think that kind of comes back to it because we also like one of the things that we struggle with here is most often you see the way people organize is reactionary organizing, right? From one crisis to the other. All right, one person's killed, so therefore we'll have it's a crisis to an event. Versus what does visionary organizing look like, which is what Grace Lee Boggs talks about, right? Which is you understand a structure and then you visionary organize around that. And I think the same question then comes to the film as well. How can you actually think of a film as a structure versus an event in the context of documentary? And outside of this like pain-driven model and more towards desire and building and liberation and freedom and movement. And so I think that's...
And not as a big concept, right? I think that's something Gayatri Spivak would always tell us is like, and it's something we wrote in the text, freedom means different things for different people. Part of fighting for your freedom is fighting for others to be free, not with your freedom. And I think in whether it's indigenous communities or Palestine, whoever, the nation state isn't a reflection of that. So then the question for us is like, how can we fight for, again, something like a world in which many worlds can exist? There could be many centers of knowledge, of knowing the world, of relating. And I think that that's important. Now you say, you said it, because I've seen this, people talk about stuff all the time, but the film, there's a disconnect between the ideas that we're aspiring to and the films that we produce. And I think that's been the hardest thing, is to be true to that and to sit on it. And to actually like see, because the unlearning has to do with us. We tried to use archival. We realized archival was trying to solve a problem that we're avoiding. You know what I mean? It's not just that archival is difficult to work with. It's that it's masking something. It's concealing something that we have to figure out for ourselves. It was the same with interviews and trying to use them creatively with the image. Still, that wasn't the thing. People don't want to hear, what's happening to them. They know it. We shouldn't be telling them either. So then on that project of like, the second act, it's going, with friends, it's going to different places and seeing, a prisoner release, a funeral or 2 funerals, and how you document that and how you spend your time, right? So just thinking about that. And then the same goes with the, what other, knafa, just food, and that idea of food and generosity and care. So then part of the reorientation is the resistance, but the other aspect is the generosity and care. And another aspect is struggling against something, even though the odds are, and then the final thing is recognition. And this is the important part. What we said is like, I'll use myself as an example. I went to school, I took on debt, and then I defaulted on the debt, and then I intentionally defaulted on the debt. And the idea there was like, if I spend time paying off this debt, I will have to choose jobs I don't want to live. I would have to do things that I don't want to do. So I'm not free. But if I default, then there are consequences to that. I chose the consequences, right? And the consequences were specific. There were the federal government, they were not private lenders. They were, you know, I know that they audit less than 3%. I know the government is more dysfunctional than ever. Ask Nitasha on immigration. So like things are crumbling. In that context, other people, more than 28%, if you look at the Wall Street Journal, haven't paid off their debt, their student debt. We're talking about one type of debt, student debt, more than 28%. Okay. Those people don't call themselves on strike. Even they just think of themselves as being in default. I'm on strike. What's the difference? Reality, nothing. But it's the recognition of the political act. You have coffee, you have tea with each other all the time. We do too. The difference is that's coffee or tea, or that's a political act. And all of that is recognition of spaces and cracks and where things happen. So they have us focused on the big thing. So then we run in circles, talk about big things, and we forget the actual thing that we produce daily, every moment with our own bodies. And then you want to make a film about freedom?
Great. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts in my mind, but I wanted to see if other people wanted to ask a question. I see Flo. There was Ella and Rose before, which are not there anymore. Zaino, I don't know. Any?
I mean, I can comment, but I feel always like with these kind of things, I thought it was such a interesting and inspiring introduction. Thank you so much for that. And also beautiful images already. I always need some time to digest, I guess, but I really love how you talk about this process. And I think like the context you're giving to the images really makes so much sense. Somehow also, maybe more because of the context, it kind of reminded me of another talk I had recently with someone who started the project also in Palestine, but then which was called Campus in Camps. I don't know if you know the project, but I thought there as well, and maybe in a similar way, somehow with this approach of trying to I don't know, maybe capture a moment in time, but then also an idea of breaking through certain structures that have been there for a long time. I really like the way he was like talking about this idea of like prolonged kind of exceptional temporariness of like the refugee camp, for example, and then how kind of like as a contradiction to the initial idea of it, maybe it can also create this condition for transformation or for like thinking beyond a certain structure or so. And I don't know, I thought it was just your approach. I find it really, really intriguing and really inspiring. Also the idea of still like kind of continuously having this struggle or having this conversation together, I guess, of like, even what you said, like filming on the tripod or filming while like maybe like walking along, or how do you relate to that in your own way, maybe. But I was really curious if now more to properly get that, if then if I understand well, throughout the film, there will be no conversation or no, it's all indeed like observational in a way of like certain, may that be like
the first act, as you saw, was like, that's why I mean how things can begin in some way and end up, this film, like thinking of movement generated film, let's say, to use another example. Then it's beginning in one place and ending in another place than what film is intended on doing. So in this context, how does that translate to Act One? Well, in Act One, it's definitely more observational because it's a study. So what would that evoke for you? It would evoke for you maybe landscape theory. It would evoke for you things, again, like I think like Masao Adachi's kind of thing, right? And that whole, we're also thinking about like political films, but in a different way. It wasn't the documenting, it was getting at structure. But it was more observational in that way. Another way to think about it is dissection. It's a study. It's like, how do you frame? How do you reframe? How do you look at differently? Palestine is apt for that because you have a hilltop with a settlement. You have a wall, you have a house, you have a person putting her, clothes on. And then you have a very fancy 4-star Palestinian hotel right next to a refugee camp. Right? That is important not to show to the outside world. It's important to understand the structures of domination and how class gets infused on an architecture. So you use the camera that way. But in Act Two, the camera doesn't behave that way. The camera behaves differently because now it's about what? Refusal, reorientation, recognition, right? Now you're closer to people. Now the camera is moving with people.
And it goes in different directions and it's different.
And then the numbers of people increase. Right? So that's the multitude idea, it's the movement. So then Act Two begins with movement through alleyways to broader movements. We've seen these in movements, but then the question is, how does that inform how we film?
Yeah.
Right?
Also kind of playing with
and then that relates to your body, right? But you're not thinking, what is the role of my body? You're thinking, why am I here and what is my positionality in relation to this thing? Because I want to get free too.
Yeah. No, really beautiful. I'm very excited to watch the whole film. I'm really
yes. So to tell us more about when and where, but we need to draw to a close soon because it's getting close to 7:30, and we don't want to exploit our guests. But Zaino actually asked a question because she's with the baby's asleep. She sent it to the chat in the chat. Zaino Pekunlu, which is also part of our group on militant image of IRI. So could you expand on the modernity part a little bit? Do you use it only in relation with colonialism, or is it also about aesthetics? Sorry, my baby is asleep.
You can mention them, but I can. So in terms of, do you use it only in relation with colonialism, or is it also about aesthetics? I mean, I think the way we use modernity is definitely the way we're trying to work it into the film with its editing, with the images that we're showing. It's all about the aesthetics of modernity and the kind of space and time that modernity then, manifests. And so, the part that we're seeing around dystopia or like the settlements part, that's both colonialism and aesthetics. It's not an either or kind of a situation. And I think one of the things about aesthetics that is really important is aesthetics for us is not just like in the way the image works or just the sound works. It is the space and time that, in the context of Palestine, settler colonization has created. So aesthetics is sensing that reality every single moment, right? And it is that reality of the occupation, which is in this case, like the Israeli modernity, which looks a specific way. And, that's what you see. And so colonization, aesthetics, I mean, I think they're all part of it. And so that's why for us, aesthetics is more just the reality of living with that, occupation versus translating it in any form or something. And so I think with the film, what we're doing is just trying to create a sense of that space and time of like, how do you look at the settlements? Just the way, like learning to look at the settlements in a different way, not just as like in this, here's the settlements, is a document. What is that? What is the function of that particular architecture? What is the function of that particular, what is the power that's holding on the land? How is it holding that power? And then how can we think of unsettling that power? I think that's what comes in Act Two. So the Act One is literally just a mapping of like all these things that exist and the aesthetics of that and all of this. And then moving forward, that's the break, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
the strike. You break that colonial logic of time. You have to. And so then how does that function? The film is, hopefully it gets crazy, and then you go eventually to a whole other dimension. And I think that's the play. That's why also it's not observational, because observational is just, you know, we have a role in the making of the film. We're observing in the beginning to just map, but then it goes somewhere else. So
yeah, and another way of like, I think like, instead of, because observational comes from a whole history, and I think the reason why I think we picked up on it is because it's a dead end. Like we were not interested in observing anything, right? We're interested in changing our relationship. Like we're interested not in the sake of observational film to observe. We're interested in looking back, looking at, looking alongside to understand, so that we're able to move. And I think that, see, you can't have radical, what we say in movements, that you can't have radical action without radical thought. And in the context of film, what we're imagining is that you can't move without being able to see, not physically, but in this context of aesthetics, it's sensing it, because you know it. You don't need to see it, you feel it. It has some kind of bodily thing. So then what can the screen provide as a site of recognition for you? We're thinking like, obviously, speed. We're asking ourselves like, is it done by image? Is it in the image? Always, is it in the image? And if it's not in the image, then what does it sound like in order to feel with the image, right? That's what's important. So then that's why you saw the train. But I think in addition, the modernity is about a mastery. Modernity produces, it's a mastery of man, right? Man over everything. And that's something that we don't want, right? And that's a story that we reject and refuse. Thinking about Palestine without that broader thing is not going to be helpful. So it's a question of how does the aesthetics come from a different place that isn't modernity? Now you can say,
and
well,
that's a current reality that we all live under.
Now we're not crazy. People are doing it. The Zapatistas tried, are trying, fail, continue, are doing. Rojava, as an experience, Philip can talk more to it. We've seen it in refugee camps. It happens in certain outlier communities, sub-communities. It happens. It's happening all the time. But how then the aesthetics of film, without exploiting, try to do the same thing is what we're kind of thinking about. Now you could say, well, what readings can you have? I mean, something that set us on this path was probably A Darker Side of Modernity by Walter Mignolo, right? Now it's not Palestine, that's not the experience at all. I'm not saying that that's where it comes from, but breaking with modernity is an important aspect of thinking through the aesthetics of film as you ally yourself.
And then Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne on like reorienting our words refusal, which is refusing pain-driven research and like thinking about desire-driven research. And I think like they're also their text decolonization is not a metaphor. That was really important. And then Nelson Molendano Torres, who writes about 10 theses on coloniality and decoloniality. And in that he talks about aesthetics and like breaking from that sense of like, the way of sensing the world in this kind of colonial condition. And then like, I think those all were like really helpful to just understand, like just as, because then I think it helped us break the reality of a lot of these things. And then, going towards the end, it's more just like, doing a lot of healing and spiritual work. So it's kind of like then goes into a whole other dimension. So kind of like different dimensions you work through, and then like you end at like, like that's why the importance of not having Palestinian representatives or not thinking about Palestine as a nation state, but also like going into a whole other time. So it's got like all these different elements of the current reality, but hoping that we all can just check out in a spaceship and think of all these multiple realities that we all can have, and keeping land, water, and air central to our struggles, right? And I think that's really like, and then how do we do that with Palestine?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and what's funny is like, so then you're like, well, what is Act 3? And I think Act 3 is just like, what would it feel like to be free? And I don't like, it's imagine,
but we don't know.
But we don't like, that's really kind of, now you could say, well, how do you how do you, address, I'm literally telling you thought processes in relation to the image. Like one of the things was like, okay, well, there's caves. People used to live in caves. The caves still exist, right? Imagine people re-inhabiting the caves. Not to go back in time. There's no such thing.
Yeah.
But it's a different relationship to reality, because right now all you have, colonialism was always about enclosure of land. It's our relationship to things that are non-human, but you don't need to go with, what is that crazy word that people keep talking, the Anthropocene? Like, we don't need to get that crazy about it. It's just like, there's a way, there's a way in which the film, Palestine offers these elements if we look and we try to understand and we try to learn and we try to see differently.
And just to end it, because I think that we're like going over time, I think that the whole process has also been one of unlearning ourselves, because, I think that we're all, I come from like a middle class background in India, like everything is about upward mobility, like talking about aesthetics, like everything is about making it, you make it, in the context of what modernity looks like. You get a job, or you become like, your class is elevated to the next level. You're not from the village anymore. And I think like, no, it's true. Like it's
always be from the village.
But it's like, that's the kind of like, that's the logic we have to break, that it's okay to be from the village, right? And like, I think that was the unlearning that I had to do on myself. But then the unlearning happens even like, for example, in my relationship with Amin. It's like, the film is not just the film, it's also all our relations, and like, and kind of working through that and like changing it. And so it's like learning, it's like walking, we ask questions, which is what the Zapatistas say, or it's like this, this practice in the, training of freedom. And like, that's something that comes from Gayatri. We don't know how to be free, but we can train in being free, and it's going to be a process. And I think that's what also we're trying to do with this film, where it's not that the film, when it's done, it's its end object, but it's been a process, and that's what it's going to look like. Maybe it'll become something else with the way we show it or talk about it or all of these things. So, it's not that separate in that way.
Wow, that's wonderful. Yeah, so the way I see it is just the beginning of a conversation, because I really would like to continue to think with you and with other people about this this approach to film, and Nitasha, aesthetic is the movement that needs to be done, and now is my motto. It's an amazing sentence. It's wonderful. So Raul Prasad just put in the chat that he didn't manage to connect. He thought it was an hour later. And if we are recording a discussion, yes, if it's okay for everybody, not only we are recording a discussion, but we put it on the YouTube channel of Institute of Radical Imagination. And
sure, yeah, of course.
Yeah, and and good luck with the film and with everything, and definitely will be continuing the conversation. We have put together, Nitasha and I mean myself, a little text that is on the website with the filmography, a bibliography, and if you want to contribute to send us more idea of how to fill this filmography and bibliography, then we'll work on this text together maybe. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Sounds great.
We would love for this to continue in all sorts of forms.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. Really fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Presentation. Yeah.
It was really good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.